Great. So I do have a slide deck that I want to show you, and then what we're going to do is we're going to take some time to go through some reflections that I have on teaching and learning, and then also give you a chance to interact just a little. Given that we just have an hour together, I want to be really sensitive to trying to share some things with you and evoke some ideas, and at the same time recognize that we have some limited real estate here. So I want to do that as well. Before I jump into that slide deck, though, one of the things that I think a lot about as a teacher is that I certainly have an agenda of where I want this to go today, but part of my agenda is to ask you if you have an agenda. Like if there's anything that you need from me, anything that you want to add to the agenda along the way. So I'm trying to do my best to communicate with you and move us along. I hope you know that I'm always available, as some of you have already recognized, and I'm pretty good at getting back to you as you need things. But is there anything in particular, like sort of at a meta level, that you have questions about me, questions about the class that perhaps I can answer for you before we jump into anything? Either I am brilliant and you don't have any questions, or you are brilliant and you can just read my mind. I'll take either one of those, but I hope you know that that question is always open. I never want any of you second guessing what we're doing. I want you to just focus in on what you love, and I want to try to help with that along the way. So that'll be an open question, and we'll go from there. So, okay, I'm gonna do the awkward transition now, and I'm gonna set up my my screen here. Let me see if I can do that. Okay, do you all see pedagogical perspectives? Do you all see that? Give me a thumbs up if you see that. Okay, great. Oh, look at that participation. That was so good. Great. So I want to just take some time today to frame a little bit about some of the modules that you're going to be having in the upcoming weeks. Part of my goal for this class is for you to simply reflect on your teaching. Why do you teach? How do you teach? What motivates you to teach? What are your own blind spots? What are things that you have to sort of think about as you step into teaching and learning spaces? And I think that we find in the teaching that perhaps you're going to be doing as you continue to think about your careers is actually a pretty vulnerable space. You sort of open yourself up to environments and to people, and you have to sort of navigate the room, or whatever that room looks like, whatever that space looks like. And probably with teaching, or with pastoring, or even with counseling, probably those that do their best are those that are pretty self-aware of sort of their own sort of things that they sort of bring into that space. And so, you know, a lot of teaching and learning is just about that. So I want to spend some time just sort of thinking about that, reflecting on that, and talking a little bit about the learner as well, because I think it's important for us to understand who perhaps we are teaching, or at least have the tools to think about who that might be as well. So as we think about this, again, my agenda for today really comes down to this. I want to remind you that you're welcome and that you're always welcome. And then I've already sort of checked in. I want to do some takeaways, and then it looks like I missed a bullet there that switched on me there. What makes learning hard? I'm going to ask that question. And then what makes teaching hard? And then I'm going to shift and just sort of talk about some ways that we can think about this shift from a sort of teacher-centered perspective to a learner-centered perspective, and then try to leave us thinking about some takeaways along the way. So let me just start with this for a second. What, if you could think about this for a second, what do you think makes learning hard? If you're like a verbal processor and you want to like unmute and say something out loud, go right ahead. If you're like, I'd rather just chat something in the chat, you can do that as well. But what do you think? What makes learning hard, do you think? What would you say about that? Again, I can't see all of you on the screen. Oh, go ahead. So yeah, just unmute and talk. That would be great.
I would like to say something. I think for me, it is being able to have 100% of my mind on it. Like
Oh, okay.
having
Talk more
having
about that.
100% of my attention on it. That makes it really hard.
Okay.
I wish the only thing I could do in my life will be learning. That way I will be 100% taking into my soul and mind, but life happens, so it is hard to divide it. So that makes it hard. That life must go on. You cannot hold on and just do that for a living, I guess. That will be that for me.
I thank you for that comment, and thanks for that honesty too. I really appreciate that. So yeah, thank you. Thank you. What else we got here? Let's see. Let's see. What do we have here? Dylan, let's see, I got to read here. When the content doesn't connect readily to existing structures of meaning. Yeah. And that there's this, what do you have here? In that lack, there isn't enough information to attach to. Okay, great. So there's some great learning theory there, right? We talk about this idea of if something is presented, but we have nothing to, like an experience or other knowledge to attach it to, it just sort of floats out there. And so grasping the concept or knowing where to put that sort of in our own sort of sense of knowledge can be really, really difficult. Love that. That's very theoretical. Good learning theory comment there for a PhD student. Love it. What else? Again, if you want to shout out, you can go ahead and do that. I think someone else is going to say something. Feel free. And I'll keep looking at the chat too. Jeremy, I love what you're saying. Learning isn't always a natural process. You know, our own wounds, traumas, failures are confronted by truth. And so it requires a trust in that truth that will lead us to greater healing and hope. Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. We also find that in learning theory that probably from more of an evolutionary perspective is just that learning, it eats up a lot of our energy, right? So we like things that we assume we already know. Anytime that we're forced to think about things in new ways is an effort. And is quite difficult. That's why a lot of times when you talk with people and you maybe offer them something, the first answer is that can't be, right? It can't be true, right? Our reaction is to dispel it because it forces us to actually have to reimagine some things. And then sometimes it brings up, Jeremy, like you said, our own backgrounds, traumas, challenges associated with that. What else we got here? Darren, the teacher and the school functions in a world of meaning that is often foreign to me. And so I'm transitioning and learning and making the content relevant to myself at the same time. Yeah, I would love to hear more, Darren, about that. But I do think you're right. I mean, I wonder if you had this experience when you stepped into a new program, whether it's the PhD program or another program. There's almost like a language and a culture and a discourse that you're picking up on, assumptions about a body of knowledge that you're supposed to draw from that you don't always have when you start a new program or a new body of interest or whatever. So there's just a lot of work that goes on that. And I think you're right. I mean, transposing that and making sense of that can be really, really challenging and difficult. I think a lot about that as a pastor when we expect people to show up at church and just kind of know what's going on, right? I mean, sometimes the anxiety isn't because they don't like God. They just are showing up and people are acting and saying weird things that they don't know what category to put that in, right? Then we ask them to raise their hand because they're new. I mean, what a horrid thing to do to them. So, so you have sort of that interesting concept going on there. Well, again, the teaching and learning that's happening there. Alice, what did you say? When the way to learn, what questions to ask, what to pay attention to, and how to approach new knowledge has not been modeled well. Right. So there's sort of a way of the way we learn that can make a difference, right? So it's more than just perhaps the content. There's something much deeper there, and there's sort of a posture associated with that. Love that. Love that. Anybody want to add anything else?
Yes, I was being a good little schoolgirl and putting my hand up.
Oh yeah, look at that. Okay.
Well, at the moment, for me, what makes my learning hard is knowing when to stop and take something really seriously and read it again and again, and when to move on, i.e. like constant filtering that you do at graduate level. Do I need to just skim read this, or is this like an epiphany moment? And just that filtering process, and that I guess it's discernment, isn't it, that I'm trying to articulate. Yeah, so what makes learning hard for me at the moment is having to discern.
Yes. Oh, that's really honest, Lucy. That's really great. In this class, you read every word and you ponder it. No, I'm joking. Right. But that we, as graduate students, we do have to sort of learn that in a class that I teach on with research. I mean, I literally teach my students, like, how do you read a research article? Like, you don't read it all the way through, right? Like, you can't do that. If you're looking for research that pertains to your topic, there's a way of actually approaching an article where you look at first things first and to discern whether or not it's even relevant to your research, right? So I think there's a skill that comes with the way that we even acquire information as we think about our learning. So I love what you're saying about that, and it takes some time as well. So absolutely. Shek, when learning does not lead to real transformation. Okay, yeah, that's hard, right? Sometimes it feels like it's irrelevant, right? The information that we have, or we don't know what to do with it, right? Or it feels rote, right? I think there are ways that that can make learning really, really hard, or at least certainly hurts our motivation as well. Right? Why are we doing this? Yeah, I love that. Yeah, really, really good. These are great things. And there's probably more, right? And I think you shared last week just like some of the best experiences that you have. But I think there is this reality that learning is actually is hard, and it's hard for all of us, and it doesn't necessarily easily. We'd love for it to come easily, but it doesn't necessarily always do that. And, you know, one of the ways we can think about it, too many words, this is the only slide that I have this many words on. Never do this normally. You're PhD students, so this is the only time I'm going to do it. Is, you know, when we think about this idea of learning, it really roots itself in this idea of sort of this idea of meaning making and critical reflection, right? One of the original researchers on sort of this idea of transformative learning, Jack Mesereau, talks about this idea that to make meaning is to make sense of an experience, right? Like we are making sense of the things that we're processing, whether that experience is something that we learn cognitively, or if it's something that we learn experientially. We're somehow trying to orient ourselves to what is actually going on. And then he says this, he says, when we subsequently use interpretation to guide decision-making or action, then meaning becomes learning. So the learning happens when we begin to make sense of whatever we're sort of taking in and thinking about it. And he goes on and says this in the blue down there, learning may be defined as the process of making a new or revised interpretation of meaning of an experience, which guides subsequent understanding, appreciation, and action. Okay, so there's a movement that begins to happen when we actually take into account the meaning that we're making and then the learning that we're doing. He goes on and talks about this idea of two really, I think, really crucial things, this idea of reflection and critical reflection. He's used other terms in the past of critical reflection of assumptions, and then this idea of critical self-reflection of assumptions. But the idea when we learn of critical reflection is, what he would say is this involves the critically evaluating of the validity of the assumptions, belief, feelings, or actions being communicated to you. So when information comes our way, we don't just take it as rote. We not only take the information, but then we're sort of asking the question, well, where's this coming from? What point of view is this coming from? How are we supposed to sort of take the information that's coming our way? Is it valid information? Is it, what parts can I hold on to? What do I have to maybe juxtapose against another perspective, or whatever is going on there, right? Ultimately, this is kind of gets to the point of like a literature review, right? You're pulling together different perspectives and voices, things that harmonize and things that that are dissonant, that are making that possible. And so this idea of critical reflection is really important. But he goes on to say this, is that when it comes to this idea of transformation, there's also this element, let me see if I can get it here, of this idea of critical self-reflection. And what he talks about here is that critical self-reflection, or ultimately critical reflection, is an assumption that involves the critique of a promise upon which the learner has defined the problem, And then this leads to some sort of transformation or even social as well. So not only are we critically reflecting on what's coming our way, but we actually are thinking about our thinking. We're critically reflecting on the assumptions that we bring to the table as we process information, right? And so what makes learning hard sometimes is that when we're unaware of maybe the assumptions that we are using to learn, to discern, to take in information, it can have dramatic effects on the way that that learning can happen. In some learning theory, what's interesting with this, and perhaps you've had this experience either personally or you've worked with someone that has, sometimes when it comes to just sort of critical reflection of assumptions, what you're doing is you're debating a topic and you're sort of bringing in different perspectives to debate the topic. Most people are pretty comfortable with debating topics generally, okay? Now we live in a world of public discourse, so that's not always the case, right? To me, like, that first category is like Twitter. Like someone says, I had a nice day today, and someone else will say, so do you hate all the people that didn't have a good day today? You know what I mean? Like they're like, there's this positive and negative sort of element that comes with us questioning people's assumptions as to why they're like making a statement or whatever. But the real magic and the real energy and the real emotion comes when you touch on something in your own life or someone experiences in their life, where all of a sudden you ask them to question something that they don't think needs questioning. Okay, have you ever been in a situation where all of a sudden you bring something up and the other person has never thought about questioning that assumption, right? Oftentimes what happens is you get an emotion, okay? Anger, energy, rejection, a response that seems a bit more dramatic than perhaps where the conversation was going, right? It's in those moments that we know, either personally or as we're interacting with someone else, that we've touched on something that for them is like a non-negotiable. It's something that's deep and foundational for them, that they've never thought about questioning before. And sometimes this is really, really a hard space, because learning sometimes forces us to actually question the very assumptions that we have in the way the world operates. Piaget talks about this idea of like you have assimilation, right? Assimilation is when you take information and it fits neatly into the container of the way that we view the world, right? Accommodation is when all of a sudden we gain information or have information where the container that we hold the world isn't big enough to hold it and actually has to completely be destroyed in order for it to be something bigger. This is where in Christian circles all the times, like especially famous people like to tell the world that they're deconstructing. And I'm like, well, congratulations, you're learning. Like that's not that big of a deal. But these are the moments in many ways where people are sort of radically thinking about the foundational elements of who they are and how they process the world that they're sort of renegotiating. And this is dramatic, hard work. It's a form of conversion, right? I think especially in evangelical circles, we sort of take conversion rather lightly, like just believe in Jesus or like convert to Christianity. But true conversion from a teaching and learning standpoint, and I think from a formation and transformational standpoint, is like the blowing up of one's world. It's completely looking at the world differently than we did before. It means that if, as one of my students would say in some of the research that I did, they said to me, they said, if this is true, whatever we were talking about, that means everything that's attached to it isn't true either. And I don't know what to do with that, right? This is what actual learning is all about. And I think it's just important for us to sort of remember that the space that we hold, whether it's like online or the classroom or one-on-one with a student or whatever, is such a holy and sacred space. We're not just disseminating information or wowing people with our knowledge or getting people to, do what we want them to do. We're actually inviting them into actually changing the way that they think about the world so that it may become more true to reality. And there's a conversion that comes with there, and a sensitivity and a gentleness and a vulnerability that's all sort of wrapped up in that. And so learning is hard, not just from an intellectual standpoint, but it actually has even a more holistic element to that. And this sort of came through in what you read with Parker Palmer and and what we talked about this last time. So let me just take that a little bit further. This idea of vulnerability and some of the work that we've been doing, especially with those in their 20s, like emerging adults. That's emerging adults is like 18 to 30 years old. There's some research out there that talks about this idea that the lives that we live are actually kind of rooted in sort of this idea of an epistemological stability or instability. Okay, really basically like this idea of perceive and like, is there really? I mean, like some of you are going to be like, is there really stability? Are we really ever really like stable? I know we're not. Like, but there's this perceived stability of the way the world works that sometimes people hold, and it like the world makes sense, and it's just a great place to be. There are things that come across in their lives, experientially or educationally, that brings about and evokes this instability, and then the hope is that somehow we get to a maturing stability. Somehow we work through that. This idea of stability oftentimes is described as familiarity. Things make sense. We feel a connection with the world and with the way things perhaps are going in our lives. There's even an element of conformity where not only do I believe it, but somebody else believes it, so it must be true. There's this idea of just things making sense. But then all of a sudden you have this tipping point of instability where all of a sudden the way we've maybe thought about something or viewed the world or a particular situation begins to sort of crack, begins to fracture in some sort of ways. And this is the moment that we feel this sense of vulnerability. There's this sense of longing and loss where perhaps we're longing for something more. And we're also lamenting something that perhaps we have to let go of, and the way we maybe sort of saw the world or the way that we believe something. There's intellectual, emotional, and relational upheaval. All those pieces are at play. So it's an embodied experience. A lot of times there's doubt. There's not necessarily an apparent answer as to how to solve the problem. And so there's dissonance with that. And so this sort of compels us to search for new resources. We can't go back to what didn't work. We're looking for something new, but we don't know what that is. And there's also a sense of opportunity, right? It's not all bad. Like sometimes this idea of instability isn't like something bad happened to us. It actually is this quest that we're on to become, to learn something, to unpack something, to become something. To try something, to step out towards something, right? These sort of actions in our lives create this instability. Sometimes it's negative. Sometimes there's a tragedy in our lives and we don't know what to do with it, or we're faced with a situation that we hadn't planned of. That's part of it as well. But we sort of have that. Eventually, though, we want to get to this maturing stability where there's this sense of almost of a coming home, probably in an epistemological and even a theological sense. There's this reconnection with people or the way that we feel like we're living in the world. There's a reorientation in the direction that we're going, where now we kind of know the next step to take. And there's this sense of renewed energy and vision where we actually feel energized to move forward, where perhaps we didn't when this sort of was on the onset. So in good, probably Christian and discipleship theory, we know that in some ways what happens in these moments is that when we have a sense of stability and then instability comes along, the reaction sometimes is to go back to what's familiar, right? Like, that can't be, I don't know what to do with that. I want to actually move back to the sense of stability. Not only do we do that, but actually those that we are connected with want us to do that as well. A lot of times in, like, let's say ministry settings, like someone will raise, especially as I work with young people will tell me, I try to tell somebody that I'm really wrestling with something. And all I get from the people that my mentors or whatever is they're calling me back to like, well, just read your Bible more, or don't forget about the church, or, don't forget where you came from, right? Now, some of those elements are true, but you almost see this pulling back rather than working through. And this is when for people that are kind of working through this instability, it can really, really feel disorienting as well. There's other research that I've done that part of the reason that we do that is that we are collectively learning as well. So if you raise a topic, like let's in this class, and one of you finds that something that's raised is sort of disorienting to them, sometimes what we do is we try to shut down a particular person or answer the question quickly, not because we want to just solve it for them, but we don't want to feel the dissonance, right? So if I can quickly solve the problem, then I don't have to deal with whatever you've raised either, and I don't have to work it as well. This happens a lot of times in family systems and also in churches, where have you noticed that there are some subjects that nobody talks about? That's the moment where everyone has sort of collectively decided that we won't go there so that we don't have to deal with it. And so the learning actually stops. We've created a false sense of stability because we're unwilling to work with the instability. So this can happen all the time. It can happen in classrooms, right? Like all of a sudden, if it's not a safe space or whatever, we can kind of go through the motions of class, but we never really go deep or really talk about anything significant, simply because we sort of float across the top because nobody wants to get scathed. And so we just sort of make it to the other side, put in the grade, and then move on to the next class or whatever it might be, right? So this can happen all the time, but we know that, you can't go back. You kind of have to work through it. And this is the work that I think comes with us as we think about learning, as we think about teaching, that we have to help people through the instability. Now, what we've learned in some of the additional research that we've done with students is oftentimes the assumption is that instability and stability kind of look like this, that we typically live pretty stable lives. Sometimes something comes up where there's instability, and then we work through it and we get through the other side, right? So instability is sort of episodic. Like it happens rarely, once in a while, and when it does, we sort of treat it as sort of a problem to be solved. We help them work through it, and then we move on. But in reality, I think most people's lives, this is what it actually looks like, that there's rarely stability, that our lives are constantly in motion, that we are constantly negotiating and navigating experiences and information that's coming our way. And so we live in this constant state of instability, questioning and reimagining and reconstructing the things in our lives. And if this is true, then it seems like the role of the ministry leader, the teacher, the professor, is to live with this assumption and think about what it means for us to help people whose lives are in motion, who are constantly having to navigate new experiences in their lives. How do we give them the tools to live well within this space, rather than assuming that this rarely comes up? And we just help them in those episodic times, rather than thinking about the fact that this is sort of the state of our lives. What does learning look like? Maybe learning is hard simply for this reason, that our lives are constantly in motion. And so with this posture, it helps to sort of maybe reimagine a little bit about what it means to help learners as well. Interestingly as well, and some of the work that I've done with college students and more in faith formation, this idea of instability and working through it as well. Sometimes I think in many contexts, educational contexts, religious contexts, is often sort of stuck in the intellectual. Like if I'm stuck or I'm having a problem, it's probably because I'm not thinking about it right. And what I need is more information, right? So in ministry circles, it's like, we'll just read a book, we'll listen to a podcast, it'll solve the problem, because somehow we think that right thinking leads to right behaving. That's not always the case. What we find in meaning making, and as we find in formation, is that there's an intellectual, emotional, and relational component to it, that they're all at play with each other. That sometimes the reason that I'm in instability is not because that we're in this endeavor that that pulls on our intellect, but also pulls on our emotion, and it pulls on our relationships as well. In some surveys that I've done with college students, I asked them, I said, so tell me what recommendations would you give to faculty? Like what would be advice that you'd give them as you've sort of gone through your education? And here's what they said. They said, be approachable and accessible. Notice the relational component there, that doesn't always happen. Like, so, and you even brought that up in some of your stories that you told, right? The people that spent time with you, the ways that they seem to be accessible to you beyond sort of the clear curriculum to something beyond that. So this probably isn't surprising to you. They said be enthusiastic, inspiring, creative, and organized. I cannot tell you how many times organized came up in that. Maybe we experienced this a little bit where we had the slight contradiction in my syllabus, and that didn't really evoke organization in that moment. And so many of you were asking me, like, when are we meeting, right? You wanted to get it right? So, I think that there's something true about just sort of holding those elements as well. They mentioned this idea of being able to connect the material to real life, right? It has to go somewhere. If it doesn't spill out beyond the classroom, number one, I think that sometimes that means that students aren't learning. And number two, it just doesn't always seem relevant. And so our students brought that up. They talked about this idea of smaller discussion-oriented input, inviting classrooms are better, right? That's nothing new. I mean, this idea of dialogue, I think is really important. In any way that we can nurture and cultivate that, I think that that's good. Students have perceptions of their professors as well. We don't have time for me to get into all the details today, but especially in public universities, students look to professors not just as teachers, but they look to them as experts and also sometimes as mentors as well. Not always, but it's interesting to think about the perceptions that students have of us in roles of as teachers and what they're expecting of us. In Christian schools in particular, students are looking for not only experts in their field, but they see the professor as a mentor. Now, this isn't always in the job description of the faculty member, but it's interesting to think about what their expectations are and what they bring to the classroom, not only about what they're going to learn, but who they're learning it from, which I think is really, really powerful. And then the other thing that I think is really powerful, and we find this in a lot of student development literature as well, is that the classroom is always high risk. Okay, I think we love to believe like this space is the space that we're going to be really honest with each other and we're going to share a bunch of things, but we know there's limitations to the classroom. One with just an online technology or just the time allotted. I think that's the other piece. But even more than that, especially with college students, and I think it's true with grad students as well, I've experienced it in my classes, is that there's a risk involved with raising one's hand in the classroom. To say I don't get it, to be honest about where I'm coming from, to disagree with the professor or the teacher. And so this level of risk creates an interesting dynamic that I think we need to think about. And maybe perhaps just to be honest and say, well, maybe there's limitations to the formal classroom. Maybe there's things that we can accomplish in that space, but some of the other goals that we have for maybe our learning outcomes or the goals of the class actually have to happen outside that classroom. Again, in student development literature, there's a unique study and work done on this idea of the difference between day campus and night campus. Day campus is what students experience when they go to class and kind of do the formalized rhythms of whatever school is allotting them to do. I go to class, I do my homework, I raise my hand, I show up when I'm supposed to, right? And there's a certain amount of learning and teaching that happens there. But most theorists suggest that where the real learning happens is night campus. These are the unstructured places where students go, whether that's extracurricular activities, or that's hanging out with friends, conversations in the dorm room or at the coffee shop, going out and partying. There's actually meaning making that's happening in these moments and in these spaces where a lot of times students are actually exploring and trying to answer the deepest and most important questions that they're navigating. So it's interesting for us to think about teaching and learning, what that means as we hold space for students. What conversations can we have in the day campus environments, and what's actually happening maybe beyond our scope, or perhaps in the non-structured spaces where we encounter the students. Perhaps there's just different ways that we approach them, talk with them, think about them, and work with them. And I find that that's really probably really true. Yeah. So, it's just sort of interesting to think about that. So these spaces create some interesting sort of challenges. I'm just going to like breathe. Does anybody, it's hard for me to talk and keep up with the chat. So if there's anything in it, any of you want to like react to or say, wow, that, I'm thinking about this, or that makes me think of this, or I have any questions that you have, I'd love to just kind of hear like what's sort of connecting with you right now.
Yeah, I do have a question, or maybe a clarifying question.
Yes, Eunice, thanks.
I might be wrong, but I think what I think I'm getting or kind of trying to understand from the presentation is that stability is more or less like the goal of learning, or what we are trying to achieve, both for the teacher, the instructor, and the learners. That is the learning process. What we are trying to achieve is stability. Am I on point?
That's a great question. So yes and no. Stability is precise, it's descriptive. That our students are sort of coming with a body of knowledge is working. And I think part of our job is to sort of understand where they're at, what assumptions they're bringing to the table, and to be sensitive to the fact that as we are embarking on a new topic in our classroom or teaching or whatever, that it could evoke a range of emotions and responses as they navigate in new information that comes their way. And so if we're sensitive to where our students are coming, I think it allows us to attend to the journey that they're on as we help them work through oftentimes instability to find a place where they can begin to maybe incorporate or reimagine how whatever we're teaching fits into the way that they think about or their perspectives along the way. So, in a perfect world, like the stability kind of goes on forever. Like we're constantly in this process in movement of stability and instability. And this idea of stability and instability is not concrete. It's very loose. It's almost a perceived stability and instability. But I think there are moments, and we've all experienced this, where things make sense around us. Like we think we kind of have it, but then something new comes along and we have to renegotiate things, right? So the process is always that of renegotiating. And I think that ultimately what we're trying to do is trying to help our students have a clear picture of perhaps the way the world works in light of perhaps the topic that we're expert in or that we're teaching in or whatever happens there. So certainly there's this sense of helping them in their meaning making that could evoke a sense of stability, but I don't think the goal is just necessarily to get them stable. And as a matter of fact, more likely it's to help them live well through their stability and instability, wherever that is, and to be sort of an accompaniment along the way in that process. Does that make sense? Is that helpful?
Yes, just a follow-up question and then I'll keep quiet.
No, don't keep quiet. I love it.
So there's also that underlying assumption that their instructor would have achieved a certain sense of mature stability in that particular field to be able to offer that kind of guidance for the learners to kind of come to that point of being able to discern what to do with the stable and the instability that comes with life. Yes. So that's the underlying assumption that the professor for a particular has that expertise to kind of lead the learners towards the particular direction of study.
I would say yes to that. My sense would be you wouldn't be asked to teach a course unless you felt like you had some level of accomplishment of that topic. So I think that's true. I do find that a lot of times, and again, this is my point of view simply because probably of my background, there are a lot of great, brilliant people out there that are really, really smart, but haven't really thought about how they can teach what they've learned. And just because you're expert in the field doesn't necessarily mean you're a great teacher. Like that's a skill in of its own. So I would hope that as all of us spend time wrestling with the topic that we're wanting to become expert in, we certainly have that base of knowledge and an ability to guide people into that conversation. And at the same time, there's a skill of us really helping students and understanding where they're coming from as well. But absolutely, I think we bring our expertise to the classroom. I think we just have to be careful to recognize the fact that just because we bring that expertise doesn't mean that we're skilled at helping other students begin to understand that. So that's the art as we take our knowledge and begin to think about what it is to help other people. So I love that. Thank you. Did you notice that Eunice shared a question, and I think she was unharmed by that. Like, I think she's still smiling. So if other people have questions, this is a great chance to do that. Eunice, thanks so much for sharing that. If you type something and it's burning inside of you, please just like, don't feel free to read it or just say something. That'd be helpful to me.
Well, I'll say, and maybe this is not the appropriate venue for that, but I am interested in having a larger discussion on integrative education and this idea that the education system should be cultivating the holistic person and all these kind of out of the classroom experiences. I mean, I think as a goal for all people, that's great, but like, what's the role of the institution in that? And because that's kind of comes down to the question of like, why are you teaching? What's the purpose of it? Is it to help people find their purpose in life, as Palmer would say, or is it something else to maybe give them one piece that they need to integrate with other stuff?
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, I mean, you raise a great point, right? Like I feel this all the time as a faculty member. It's like how much more can we do? Like, there's only, so many weeks in the quarter. I only have so much time. What is my role? And at the time, I do think we play a role in hopefully the meaning making of people, where somehow what we study or we're working on contributes to the bettering of society and hopefully the bettering of people as well. So, I do think there's a tension that you've raised, which I think is really, really fair. And I think there's nothing wrong with us declaring our limitations as well. Like, I can't counsel you, student. I can't be there all the time, right? In some ways, there's something deeply theological about that, right? We admit our limitations. So, but I think within the space that we've been given, I think sort of thinking about what our role is in that environment and this idea of integrative education, I think can be really, really powerful. And again, probably a bigger conversation than this, but I'm glad you're raising it. I think it's important. And it's a challenge. I think it's a challenge in higher ed right now, just because probably in most people-oriented professions, it's like we care, right? So I think our instinct is to want to do more, but I think there's also just limitations that come with that too. Fair. That's a fair comment. Thanks.
Yeah, and I'll just say, like, I think it makes sense within Christian institutions, because spiritual formation and holistic formation, that's part of our heritage and our ethics. But I wonder, like, with the secular institutions, I think there's some ethical issues there. Like, what kind of purpose are you moving them towards? On what basis? On what values? And I can see some people having some disagreement. I mean, there's the whole accusation of these are liberal educations, and they've got an agenda or whatever, which I'm sure those people would say, well, we're just trying to make them be concerned citizens and help society. And others would say, well, that's not my idea of helping society. So
yeah, well, right. I mean, there's a big debate just about what's the purpose of higher education, right? I mean, to be good citizens probably was the intent, right? But I think what we've found with a lot of institutions is they've turned into nothing more than like job training, right? So, we actually are dehumanizing students by simply preparing them for the work world without them thinking about, what is my role as a citizen? How do I think critically, and all that comes with that, right? And yeah, I think I don't know if we can ever escape agenda, but I think education is moving in a direction of just saying there's a lot of different lenses that students bring to a classroom space by which they're trying to make sense of the world, right? Whether it's their, their gender, their race, their orientation, their religious background, all these factors have an effect on the way we process information. And so I think it makes a very complex, but a very important element to think about in our teaching. Otherwise, if we just think that we're, and you're not saying this, but if all we're doing is we're like, well, I just teach the facts and then you figure it out. I think that we run into problems with that quite quickly, because we're not attending to the diversity of students that are in our classrooms and the needs that they have along the way. So it makes it hard, but I hear you. It's a big thing. Yes, Clara, I see that hand.
I'm really interested in the same topic that Alice is. And so I don't know if this is, or if we're just like hijacking your lesson plan for today, but I actually do also think that, part of the issue with Palmer, and I can't pronounce his last name correctly, so I'll just say, and Palmer and colleague, that they kind of presented this like very aspirational aim for all teaching in higher education adult settings. And I think in doing that, and sort of centralizing the role of the educational institution, they actually sort of compound the issues that they're wrestling with, because it makes it seem like you can't be formed as a human being outside of those settings. And that's and the problem with that is that then the institution continues to sort of like take into itself all of these social functionings for growing a human being, but yet they're trying to argue that we need to respect the human forming things of those people's contexts of their lives. But actually the university is kind of scooping them up and trying to replicate all those functions. So I think that part of the conversation that I hear, that Alice and I live in the same city now, so we're going to go for coffee and have this chat. But,
awesome.
But part of the thing here, I think for us as teaching practitioners, is yes, to be involved in people's, like, interested in their context, but not in like a hegemonic way, but in a way that says, what is the human formation and the learning that you are doing elsewhere? And like, let's have bridging and integrating conversations rather than trying to say, okay, you can only learn from that if you integrate it in my context, if you integrate it in the context of higher education. Because that I felt was a little bit predatory. And there were some questions for me about hegemony and the Western education system that were kind of embedded in that. So
yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. I think the way I read Palmer and his works is, I think in many ways he's trying to offer a sort of a corrective foil to a disintegrated higher educational approach that he has been a part of. And so I do think, we're always reacting and responding to something. So, I mean, even the two authors that we read, I think they speak of sort of their lives outside their own work as well. So I'm not sure that, I mean, I can't speak for them. I wouldn't say they would necessarily disagree with you. I think one of the challenges that we're discovering in higher ed generally, I mean, at least in the US educational system, is those institutions outside higher ed have been found wanting as well. Not all of them, and I'm not making a judgment on all those different institutions, but the need for student development, the need for support, the need for scaffolding to help people integrate and learn. I think the school has had to take on more of that, for better or for worse. When certainly there are some shadow sides to it, but I think the corrective might be, we don't want education simply being about disseminating information, that we lose sight of the learner and the work that's associated with that. So, and it trickles down to the way that we hold ourselves as teachers, right? I mean, we all have to sort of make those decisions as to how we're going to hold a class or how we're going to think about things. But and part of it's personality. I mean, some of us just, are going to interact with people in different sort of ways, but it seems as though there's something important about us, if we're going to think about the fact that a whole person is learning, that we have to somehow keep that in mind as we think about our teaching, or we sort of we can miss them, right? We can literally teach without the person in mind. And I think this is a concern oftentimes that we find in learning-centered teaching, that we don't want to do that. So, but yes, I wish I could join you in that conversation over coffee. That sounds like a really, really good one. So I think it's true. We have our limitations. Completely agree with that, for sure, for sure. Anybody else want to jump in?
I do want to.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I do want to step back and just voice my concern more on the pedagogical capacity of teaching, as you were mentioning. I'll use bluntly and respectfully this class as an example. That we are PhD students, and we're taking this class as a 1-unit course, kind of like on the side of the program. Like, yeah, you need to do this stuff. It's not perhaps as important as your discipline or the value of your knowledge. So I've been through my MA, THM, and I've seen amazing scholars who are not teachers, but they're teachers because they're scholars, right? And they have written book, and that really puzzles me that 99.9% of the development of teachers, of scholars, is being done on the discipline and research, and not necessarily developing the pedagogical capacity. And that really puzzles me. Even at this program level, you see this type of class. So it's just really difficult for me to look into the future and see a promise of, yes, we're developing teachers and we're segmenting scholars. And I've done through many MA or THM courses saying, yes, you are an amazing scholars, but please do not teach anymore, because you're not. There's no way for you to be in front of 30, 40 students. So yeah, that's just my thought. I wrestle with that a lot. And even in this program, I wish I could do more of these lessons, and perhaps even less on the discipline for the sake of myself to grow as a teacher.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, you all are entering a world where things are really shifting and changing, right? I think even higher education is asking some hard questions about the role of faculty. I mean, right now we value what we assess, right? So tenure is about publishing. It's a little bit about teaching, but it's mostly about service and publishing. And so, I mean, those sort of values, we can, like you say, we can give lip service to, like, we want you to be good teachers, but in the end of the day, what have you done? You know, as Dr. Joel Green would remind me, he wouldn't say it, but we would joke about it. Like, the academy is always asking, what have you done for me lately, right? So, so what do we do in those moments? Well, we are going to move toward that are going to help us advance, and at the expense of, you know, this idea of teaching and learning. And then what happens is, and this is the problem of higher ed, is we sort of perpetuate the dysfunction, right? Like, you know, who gets in the positions of like teaching? Well, the really brilliant ones, but they don't necessarily can't teach, and the only ones that make it are somehow track with them that are probably also brilliant. And, you know, we sort of perpetuate the problem. So I think you're right. I don't know what to tell you about the program. I think that the vocation formation courses at Fuller that is designed to sort of give you, you know, some of these perspectives. But yeah, one credit look certainly doesn't necessarily communicate value. And at the same time, we're trying to like not make the degree 100 credits and, you know, have you bankrupt for life or whatever as well. So, you know what I mean? Like, you know, there's so many different factors there, but I think it's really important. So, you know, personally, like, I have TAs for my classes, right? And instead of asking the institution to somehow like fix it, because I just don't know how quickly they can. You know, I meet with my TAs, we process, we lecture, I teach, we talk about learning theory. I give them opportunities to try to teach or grade in different sort of ways. And together over the course of a quarter or more, I'm trying to invest in this value in probably a way that's different than like whatever's required of the institution or whatever, simply because it's important to me, right? So, you know, sometimes I think we we kind of have to take hold of what we value and think about how we're going to perpetuate in our part of the world, right? Whatever that is. So if this is something that's important to you, then I think the challenge is to think about, well, how you're gonna do that in your sphere, right? Rather than thinking that it's always going to be institutional. We hope at some level it gets to policy, because I think that's when like real change can happen. But in the meantime, I think we have to work with what we have. So I feel the tension, believe me, and I appreciate you raising that. Thanks. Oh my gosh, it's noon. I literally thought I had another like 20 minutes. That's okay. This is what we're going to do. I have a little bit more I think I want to share, but I promised you this was an hour, and I don't want to overstep that, but I will record the other half of this lecture that I had, and I'll post it for you to go from there. I really appreciate the tension that you're feeling and the questions that you're raising. I do think it's important at a very, very foundational level to ask ourselves, as we think about what it means to be a scholar, to think about what do we do with what we know? How do we share it with others? What does that sharing look like, and how do we think about that? And I do think there's a teaching and learning component in there that at some level that we have to wrestle with if we're truly going to be effective in the endeavors that we're a part of. So don't lose sight of that. I think it's important. So with that in mind, at the top of the hour now, let me leave you with this, my friends. May you continue to be learners, no matter how much you think that you know. May you not be afraid to question maybe some of the foundational assumptions that you have about the way that you look at the world. And may this experience that you have drive you toward empathy, toward those that you engage and teach and mentor and lead. And may you know God's grace and peace. Thanks, everybody. Great to see all of you. Time goes really fast, which is quite fun. So we'll keep that in mind. So, okay, we'll be in touch. Take care all.